I'm really pleased to introduce our presenter today. Patrick has over 25 years of experience in sustainable urban design, first as a professional city planner and then as a teacher and researcher. He started his academic career in 1985 at the University of Minnesota before moving to the University of British Columbia in 1992. He holds a UBC James Taylor Chair in Landscape and Livable Environments. In that capacity, he's worked to advance sustainable urban design in scores of jurisdictions in the US, Canada, and Australia. He's also the founding chair of the UBC Urban Design Program, where he still teaches, and is the author of many books, including 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities, and most recently, 5 Rules for Tomorrow's Cities, Design in an Age of Urban Migration, Demographic Change, and a Disappearing Middle Class, which is the topic of today's webinar. Both of his most recent books have been published by Island Press. So with that, Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Jesse, and it's a real pleasure to be talking to so many people around the world, and quite amazing that I can reach out this way to all of you. And it's sort of metaphoric that at the same time we can do this kind of reaching out, we're also struggling with another consequence of modern life, which is the coronavirus, which China is valiantly trying to contain. So in a sense, that's probably the proper framework for what I'm going to talk about, which touches on that kind of issue and others. I have a written text here, which I'll go through and digress from time to time. I'll try to keep it as interesting as I can. So I will proceed. This work of this book and the thinking behind it represents an attempt to answer the following question: what will tomorrow's city builders need to think about? What are the issues that we are not addressing as a discipline of city builders? Of course, there are many books and lots of information today, rightfully so, focused on climate change and on building ecologically resilient cities. But it seems to me there is a real dearth in books about other planet-wide changes that are also critical. We suggest that there are at least 3 massive changes that are occurring simultaneously along with the climate emergency, and they will certainly impact the success or failure of our cities. The first up is a worldwide and massive rural to urban migration, where rural dwellers are abandoning their villages and towns for major metropolitan areas, often within their own country or for major cities in entirely different countries. These migration waves are peaking in developing countries like Nigeria, India, and China, while the similar migrations in the developed world are nearly complete. What this means is that global cities will explode in population during the next 40 years, creating massive strains on housing and infrastructure, while life in rural towns unalterably declines. Second major change, women around the world are deciding to have fewer children, with a global fertility rate sinking to below replacement level soon. Unless this trend is reversed, our major cities in the world will grow explosively for 40 years and then stop growing entirely, perhaps forever. At the end of this demographic shift, the world will wrestle with a costly overhang of elderly citizens requiring potentially cripplingly expensive health and housing support. What this means is our cities must struggle to build housing and infrastructure at breakneck speed for 3 decades, then adapt this same city for a huge elderly cohort, and then adjust it yet again for a stable, more evenly distributed demographic pyramid after 2060. These 2 linked factors by themselves already are, in fact, tremendously disruptive to the form and function of cities. But to make it even more complex, these 2 shifts are happening at the same time that the middle class, as we have come to know it, is in a state of gradual collapse. This is Thomas Piketty, the author of Capital in the 21st Century, whose book popularized or verified this phenomenon as being global and being a consequence of a slowing global economy. While globalization is lifting the poorest of the world's poor out of abject poverty, this process is funneling the preponderance of new wealth into the hands of a smaller and smaller slice of the population, the global 1%, or to be more precise, the global 1/10 of 1%. What this means is that during the same period of explosive urban growth, the precarious middle class, or what is left of it, will have a harder and harder time securing the comforts of urban living, particularly adequate housing. This chart is specific to the United States, but it parallels most of the developed economies, Canada, Australia, and European ones. The charts for the developing world are different, but the underlying trends are still the same. So what does this all mean? It means in the next 40 years, existing cities will double on average and then stop growing, perhaps forever. And when the dust clears, the social landscape, now dominated by the already tottering middle-class landscape of suburban sprawl, will evolve into a new socially stratified landscape of the wage-earning class on the one hand and the increasingly self-isolated investor class on the other. Cities are already visibly segregating in this way, and these trends are not slowing, they are accelerating. My book is an attempt to make some sense of all this and present it in an accessible way for those charged with somehow managing this madness, like all of you listening today. And here's where it gets tricky. Prognostication is a dangerous endeavor in the best of times, and these may not be the best of times, but certain things are fairly clear. Against the background of these three great waves of change, we can be fairly certain of a few things. One, city builders will have to get better at adapting our city for new inhabitants. Two, we will have to calibrate the cost of city living to what age earners can afford to pay, an amount that is decreasing each decade. Three, we will be well advised to calibrate our infrastructure such that it works with natural processes, not against them, and in so doing, keep up and replace infrastructure in measure to what taxpayers can afford to pay. Four, understand that rigid segregation of our cities into housing, industrial, and commercial zones, a firm principle of the modernist age, is increasingly irrelevant to the emerging landscape of service jobs, now comprising 80% of all jobs, and its spawn, the gig economy. Fifth, of all the emerging new city districts on the planet, the most sustainable, ironically to some, when measured against a variety of ecological performance metrics, are not the gleaming eco-city experiments of China, for example, but the so-called favela or slums of Latin America, made of local materials by hand, where work and commerce and living are in the same street, often even in the same building. It is, of course, easier to agree with these 5 points than to know how to design and retrofit our cities in response. So while our responses are speculative at best, as future casting always is, the 5 rules for urban design we offer are far and away superior to the backward-looking fixations currently dominating our profession, leading us to produce largely imaginary cities or a sustainable future that no one can afford to build or buy. Fixations that leave our professionals with no more important role than executing the exclusionary objectives of our neoliberal clients. Fixations that prevent us from creating cities capable of unleashing the entrepreneurial and creative possibilities of our citizens. So here then are alternative rules, or principles if you prefer, both historically well-grounded as well as calibrated to our new, difficult urban design realities. The first one is to see the city as a system. Cities are organic, growing, and changing in responses to the phenomenon I've described, in response to interior and exterior influences. Jane Jacobs was the first to articulate this truth, and it is even truer today. As these three great waves sweep across global cities, it's even more crucial to attend to the subtle interrelationships between the functions and materials of the city in planning and design. Easier said than done, as systems theory teaches us that the subtle interrelationships of urban elements create complexities too multifold to completely understand. This is a more simple diagram than the impenetrable one that I just showed, which derives from systems theory that talks about the simple that the understanding of any urban phenomenon must proceed not from an understanding of mechanical functions like transportation, but to see transportation and other issues as integrated with their pattern, their meaning, and the materials from which they're constructed. As this example tries to make clear, using the simple example of the bicycles, suggesting what aspects are process, what aspects are meaning, what aspects are pattern, and what aspects are matter. The systems theory view emerges from understanding that good planning, good anything really, good science needs to be done cognizant of all these four interrelationships, and to isolate any one of those is to miss the essence of the organism you're trying to work with. Planning methodologies described in the book explain how planning and urban design can be done and should be done in the face of these complexities, accepting them, incorporating them into a holistic, multi-stakeholder, politically sensitive planning process. The second rule is recognize patterns in the urban environment. The dialectical interaction between human agency and natural landscape always generates a pattern of streets and parcels akin to the pattern of cells and veins of a leaf. We continue to plan without clear understanding of pattern and the importance of the cellular level of the urban parcel. Huge errors have been made by urban designers who assemble broad swaths of the city, interrupting the pattern and the organic human flows of the city, impeding entrepreneurial possibility. The most efficient patterns of the world, as unlikely as this pairing may seem, are Manhattan and Greek island villages, as shown. Manhattan parcels have held many different buildings over time, yet the pattern stays the same. Greek island villages emerge from the patterns of local geography, married with local materials, assembled and scaled to the hand of man. Nothing in our contemporary world comes as close to the organic beauty of Greek villages than, surprisingly, South American favelas or slums, which emerge from the interaction of these same organic forces. Design in this time of radical demographic and organic change must be respectful of these practical prototypes and see urban design as an initiation rather than a completion. Rule 3 is to apply lighter, greener, cheaper infrastructure. Our 3 decades of plenty have left us with bad design habits. The worst of these is overspending and overbuilding urban infrastructure. The result is an urban landscape organized around the car and unaffordable urban sprawl. It will be impossible to affordably maintain this system in the future. We know this because it's already bankrupting the taxpayer. The following 4 decades should see an unbuilding of urban infrastructure, a retreat. We are already seeing this in the removal of urban freeways in many North American metropolitan areas. South American cities give us a clue of what this world looks like in their efficient transportation systems, deploying novel transport technologies like escalators, rapid buses, and aerial trams to lightly and efficiently serve informal districts of 1 million inhabitants or more. Rule 4 is strengthen social resilience through affordable housing. Here where I am in Vancouver, this is a crisis, and this crisis is spreading to most other parts of the world. I noted with some interest that the far left the relatively far left in Ireland just won a tremendous victory, largely on the frustration of their citizens with impeded access to housing. At any rate, as cities grow and inequality worsens, access to affordable housing becomes more and more difficult. It does not seem to matter what policy or taxing regimes local governments apply, nor how much supply overwhelms demand. The problem is not the cost of the house, but the cost of the dirt under the house. This is true. This is true in both the developed world and the developing world. With land prices in Shanghai close to those of New York, inequality is now largely focused on the cost of housing. Flat screen TVs, smartphones, and food are affordable to most people. Housing is not. Impeded access to urban housing is disrupting politics globally, from Ireland to Iran. The problem seems to be caused by worldwide asset inflation, an inflationary force affecting all classes of assets, but which is particularly damaging when it drives urban land prices beyond the reach of wage earners, particularly young wage earners in the developed world, the millennial class, who are essentially closed out of the housing opportunities previous generations could easily afford. Strategies such as increasing land efficiency through infill and missing middle strategies will be necessary but insufficient, as the price of housing moves inexorably away from the capacities of wage earners to pay, and the housing market utterly fails to supply housing to more than half of those who need it. Other actions are required. Sorry about that. This is a slide of Vienna. Vienna offers a useful precedent. In Vienna, more than half of all citizens live in non-market housing. The strength of this non-market housing sector is such that the market housing must compete against it. This, along with a smart taxing policy, keeps the price of urban land low. Market housing in Vienna costs roughly half of what a similar home in other European cities, say Paris, for example, would cost. The single tax theories of Henry George, once the planet's most influential political economist, are again relevant. His insight that the productive efforts of both the wage earner and the capitalist both get uselessly absorbed into the ever-inflating value of passive urban lands again seems very trenchant. Municipalities have underused taxing tools to skim off this value and apply it to the provision of non-market housing. Rule 5, adapt to shifts in jobs, retail, and wages. The automation of manufacturing, agriculture, mining, and forestry has reduced those sectors to less than 20% of all jobs. Those lost jobs have shifted almost entirely into the service sector. Developing countries in Africa seem to be jumping directly from rural subsistence economy to a service economy without a manufacturing economy in between. But while automation, robotics, and AI should already be increasing leisure time in advanced economies, the reverse is happening. The forces of inequality are pushing wage earners to work more hours for less real income in insecure jobs with reduced or no benefits. The gig economy, far from producing the freedom it promised, is increasing precarious employment at an alarming rate. The prototype for a global workforce of this type can be found in developing economies like that of India, where small-scale entrepreneurial activities generate massive aggregate wealth and allow rural to urban migrants to gain a foothold. City builders would be wise to recognize and accommodate this coming together of trends in the developed world as well, with those already so apparent in the developing. We can do this by integrating interstitial spaces in our plans for small-scale entrepreneurial activity, as is already happening in the hidden recesses, the interstitial spaces of the American suburban and urban landscape, as this example from the Alameda district in Los Angeles makes clear, with a riot of work activities occurring in the rears of these lots, while the front of these lots maintain an image of suburban domestic activity, hiding this commercial and small-scale industrial activity in the rear yards. In the USA, this shift is taking place, but often hidden in the backyards, as I've just mentioned. As suburban landscapes in the developed world are retrofit, it should be easy to authorize a much wider range of activities than our single-use zoning currently allows. And for the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians online, this is a particularly important thing to think about because our suburban landscapes are unaffordable, have incredibly expensive infrastructure to maintain, and don't allow for the integration of the kinds of gig economy or service type economies to occur, which could give them economic viability in the future and allow them to be adapted to this emerging lifestyle. So in conclusion, truly some of what I have said might seem dark and even apocalyptic, but there is a very bright side to all these transformations. A world where most people live in cities is a world where most of the landscape may be preserved. A world where population is stable may be a planet no longer threatened by too many mouths to feed. A world where our finances are more constrained may be a world less ravaged by the constant flow of stuff into first our garages and then into our landfills. A city where our living quarters are more modest can bring with it a closer-knit sense of community. A city that unleashes rather than restricts our entrepreneurial power can be more creative and vibrant city and provide a more sustainable economy. In short, these future trends may take us to the fully sustainable cities that we have all been striving for through an organic evolution, right-sizing our consumption to the productive and creative capacity of all of our citizens. Indeed, it's hard to visualize this positive future from our current vantage point, but the difference between a future that is dark and one that is bright clearly has to do with the design of cities, with how we can, with clear eyes and bold hearts, shape these changes into a city form that looks, feels, and works like a Greek island village writ large across the global urban landscape. Thank you for your attention. I'll turn it back to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Patrick. Perfect. So we're going to go in transition now into our Q&A with Patrick, and we have a bunch of questions that have already come in. So if you have a question, feel free to type it into the question control panel on the right of your screen, and we have a bunch already, so we'll get right into it. Patrick, a question from Bill Leidy. Hi, Bill Leidy. Bill lives in Alaska and is an active member of Meeting the Minds. He wants to know, wants to ask you, considering the looming threat of rapid sea level rise, what trend will that impose or inflict upon cities in 2060 and beyond? And where are we going to put millions of internally displaced people who are abandoning their underwater homes and businesses? I guess that's the first part of his question. Questions about climate migrants on coastal cities.
Well, my reaction to that is that there's going to be some tragedies. Bangladesh, for example, is going to have to deal with real significant problems. But even there's already a migration from the rural parts of Bangladesh to the urban parts of Bangladesh that are in many cases somewhat higher, and also the migrations that are global from that part of South Asia going to other parts of the world. So how I see that question is there's a simultaneity of the 100-year process of sea level rise, which is coinciding with the similar 100-year process of migration from, well, globally many low-lying areas towards urban areas. And it's clear this is going to be disruptive, and it's going to happen in the context of severe financial changes, particularly in the developed world. And the adaptation to that is going to be very difficult and interesting for cities. But I take some consolation out of what I see when I tour the favelas of South America or so-called slums of India, which actually have very vibrant cultural and manufacturing and commercial landscapes, a vibrancy not even hinted at in most parts of North America. But even our suburban landscapes could have some of that consequence as we look out 30, 40, 50 years into the future. And I really do think that it's dependent on urban designers and planners and developers and other people who are engaged in this process to adapt an existing world which we've poured many trillions of dollars worth of resources into since the end of World War II, to adapt that to this future, which includes climate change issues, it includes sea level rise, but it also includes this global migration from rural areas to urban areas at the same time that the economic capacity of the previous middle class has been undercut. It's going to change the way these cities operate. And I hope that this exploration of mine and others like it can start to open a window on those possibilities in a positive way. I try to look at the changing in the consequences of the middle class and increasing inequality, which I wish we could reverse, but it doesn't seem that it's going to be easily reversed. So I try to think about how those changes could actually lead to positive outcomes rather than the almost entirely negative outcomes that people tend to associate with that issue. That's the best answer I could give.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. So this is related to that question from Kristen Ross, who teaches urban ecology in rural Vermont. She wants to know, what are your thoughts for future planning in very small cities, say in rural New England in the United States, that anticipate climate refugees from the Boston and New York City areas in the next decades? Some conservation planners in Vermont are trying to work on how to plan for lots of local immigrants and still preserve our working and natural landscape.
Well, I haven't seen the evidence of that. Maybe Vermont is a special circumstance, but globally it seems that the trends are almost irreversible of people moving towards these metropolitan areas. And I know there's been speculation about the migration away from metro areas as these issues become more extreme. But so far, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing, and the metropolitan areas will probably have to retreat from some areas that are low-lying, even during the forthcoming 3 or 4 decades, for goodness sake. But the trend line globally is towards metropolitan areas, basically sucking up most of the migratory forces, and this aligns with the shift globally away from resource and farming, and those industries, which in the United States, for example, used to be far more than 50% of all people employed prior to World War II. Now it's all service things. It's finance. It's your dentist. It's your yoga teacher. It's your bicycle repair person. It's the barista. So we're really seeing a world where those service functions are aggregating towards metropolitan areas in greater and greater numbers, and I don't see any reversal of that within the next 50 years. I don't like to prognosticate. It's a very dangerous occupation, but I do study the trend lines, and the trend lines show metropolitan areas getting more and more population, and rural areas like northern New Hampshire and Vermont, all of Vermont, stable or declining populations over the next 30, 40 years.
Okay, good. Hopefully that answered your question, Kristen, and you can follow up with Patrick on his last slide, his contact information. Quick question for you from Sonia Anella Ingram. Are you suggesting, Patrick, that small home offices, or land devoted near homes should be devoted to manufacturing and retail goods? And how do we do that? How does government provide zero interest loans or grants in cities and rural areas now? How do we do that now, and rather than in 40 years?
Well, I think one of the interesting statistics that showed up in my travels around this topic was that in the United States, the greatest increase in manufacturing was among manufacturing enterprises that had only one employee. And that seems bizarre until you realize, well, that's basically candle makers and people who make soap and that kind of thing. The artisanal, I never can pronounce that word, the artisanal.
Artisanal, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That whole world is increasing fairly dramatically as large manufacturing in the developed nations is shrinking, and it shows that even in the United States, a lot of what you see in places like Mumbai and South America, where the level of manufacturing enterprises is one or two or three or five people, somehow working within a supply chain, or somehow manufacturing something that can be sold locally and into the international market on things like Amazon.com and so forth. So it seems to me that the most critical thing for communities to do is to, grants would be nice, but I think even more important, in my view, is just allowing this activity to happen, allowing garages, suburban garages to turn into this kind of manufacturing process, allowing suburban cul-de-sac homes to turn into 2 or 3 units, or allow them to have secondary rental suites as just part of the package, and reconfigure what is an unaffordable, monocultural, largely suburban landscape in places like the United States, where over 60% of people now live, into something much more adaptable to essentially future-proofing and allowing those activities to occur. Here in my area of Vancouver, the largest influx of South Asians goes to the city of Surrey, and the former suburban houses there have been informally adapted to 3 or 4 or 5 extended families that might have 4 generations in the same building. And in the former 3-car garage, that's where you'll go to get your trailer hitch welded on. It's really quite remarkable what's happening, and Surrey has been smart to look the other way as this kind of change occurs, creating opportunities for those recent immigrants from South Asia, and enabling a culture to emerge that's quite interesting. So that would be my take-home message. It has to do with policy.
Yeah, and Mark Lefkowitz is wondering, have you seen any examples of cities or neighborhoods that have created supportive zoning and incentives to shift and support those creative industries? Or are there a couple of cities that are doing a good job of that in Vancouver or elsewhere?
Unfortunately, in the developed world, I haven't found really good examples. I mean, the examples people point to is like live-work projects, which are usually kind of boutique ones, but they're a step in the right direction. In terms of the adaptation of a home for multiple dwelling units, Vancouver's doing a pretty good job of that compared to other places. We now allow citywide, former single-family zoning now allows up to 4 dwelling units, 2 of which would be rented and 2 of which would be what we call stratified, or in U.S. terms, condominium type units. So it's a quadrupling of the allowable density. And I suspect within the next 10 years, there will be much relaxed policies on home work. It's happening informally anyway in Vancouver, where a lot of these service industries like hairdressers and seamstresses and accountants and even lawyers and so forth. Service industries are very, very easy to incorporate into formerly single-purpose residential zones, and we're seeing that very, very clearly in Vancouver. I wish I could write a book about just that.
That's the next one. I'm sure you've got the next 3 planned out, though. Okay, great. And we have a bunch of questions that I'm going to combine, Brian Hill, Holly Campbell, and others, about the market versus non-market housing. Can you talk a little bit more, Patrick, about how that works and how it could work in North America? What are some examples of the practical steps to non-market housing?
Yeah, we're seeing a little bit of that in Vancouver because our housing crisis is so severe that people are struggling with this problem. I'll use Vancouver as a case study to explain this. What we found here is that adding density doesn't increase affordability, unfortunately. That's not always true in other parts of North America or other parts of the world, but here it's true that because there's this global asset inflation, as money goes to the 1%, the 1% are really flooding the world with their capital. And one of the impacts of that capital flood, which the central banks are supporting with very low interest rates, is that assets have become overvalued. That's true of stocks and bonds, and most damagingly, urban land in attractive places like Vancouver. So that has pushed the price of land beyond the capacity of local wage earners to pay for. So when you go and you rezone a parcel for 10 times its previous density, it doesn't make the housing cheaper. It just makes the land 10 times more expensive. That's the problem. So one strategy that's being, I hope, will be implemented here very soon. We already do some of this, but not at scale, and I think it could be done at scale, is to use the energy of capital flowing into this city from the globe as a good investment area, to use that energy of that money and not let that money flow into land value alone, where it gets almost entirely absorbed if you don't do something about it. Municipalities have, in most cases around the world, the power, certainly here in Canada, the power to tax development and use that tax dollars to supply non-market housing. Here in Vancouver, we have a history of 15% of our housing is non-market housing in the form largely of co-op housing. We stopped doing that during the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, swept along in the fervor of neoliberal enthusiasm after the so-called Thatcher-Reagan revolution. We're now stepping back away from that and re-establishing a tradition of co-op housing funded from taxing development dollars. And although this is still politically controversial because the opponents say that, well, if you tax development, it's just going to increase the cost of housing further, I'm of the camp that says, no, that's not what happens. What happens is the cost of land is decreased, because here in our city, a square foot of new building costs $1,200 a square foot, no matter what you do. And it doesn't matter if you get the land for free, the market is still going to sell that unit for $1,200 a square foot. So if you put a big tax on development, all that really happens is the land price goes down. And that's what attracted me to the theories of Henry George with his single tax on land. And this is becoming more and more important around the world as a resurgence of interest in the Henry George philosophy, because that basic supposition is the worst thing you can do in a city is to have land values increase, because that sucks all the energy of labor and capital into a non-productive use, which is land, which is the unique feature of the Henry George's philosophy. Anyway, to come back to simple policy terms, the strategy for non-market housing to finance it is not to go to the federal or the provincial government here to get that money, although their money is nice. It's nice to have money. But if used without any way of attacking the problem of land value inflation, just dumping $100 billion of federal money into the land market is just going to make the land market even more lucrative and only enhance the wealth of land speculators and not really produce benefits to property owners. So in conclusion on that, I'm sorry for such a long-winded answer. In conclusion on that, the strategy that seems quite reasonable and only impacts land speculators is to tax development to both moderate the cost of land and produce tax revenues to put into non-market housing. That is precisely what they did in Vienna back in the 1920s. And it's a mechanism that worked very well there and could work in any capitalist location, which is almost everywhere these days.
Right. Good. Okay, good. Brian Hill and Brent Cooper, I'm going to combine their questions. Brian is saying, if we're going to continue to see populations wane in small and rural areas, how do we provide for social and economic stability in those places? And then I'm going to combine Brent's question. He said, wouldn't it make sense to bring technology to rural communities to revitalize them and reverse the urban trend? And following up with automation, the potential growing need for a universal basic income, shouldn't we be pursuing such values and programs? So question about how to revitalize shrinking rural and small towns, and is there a role for technology in UBI?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, my book is to some extent intentionally provocative by trying to underline what is a global trend, and it's very difficult to reverse. But having said that, I think it's reasonable to think that we can, since we've invested, and particularly in the American landscape and other developed nations, we've invested a fair amount of our energy and tax dollars into the maintenance of a national system, not just a metropolitan area system, that it seems reasonable to be thinking of ways to stabilize that population, even if it's not going to grow in the future. A lot of the lovely places in the world have that characteristic of not having grown for 200 years. And, I'm still thinking about the Vermont instance. That's certainly true there. So with something like a guaranteed income, that would be a way to stabilize those locations. And with the possibility of remote working, I mean, there's already that happening. I might have understated the possibilities for Vermont to attract refugees from New York, because I understand also that because housing is so unaffordable in places like New York and Boston, a lot of people are casting their gaze lovingly at these rural locations to take advantage of affordable housing and beautiful lifestyle for their families. So there's nothing as simple as maybe I've described it, and I think that the suggestions about remote working and finding economic supports for people, kind of along with Andrew Yang's campaign, which he just stopped last night. There is the economic capacity in advanced nations like the United States, with a lot of proponents saying the only way out of the mess that artificial intelligence and automation is creating is to make sure that people have resources to keep the whole capitalist economy going. And to the extent that that happens, you could do that just as well in a rural area as an urban area. So, but that is against the current wave forces, which is drawing everybody towards these metropolitan areas and competing in the service industry and the gig economy, which is going on now.
Great. There's a bunch of questions about transportation. First, let's talk about high-speed rail. Christopher Pollin's asking what you think, Patrick, about the proposed high-speed rail plan to connect Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. Do you think it'll happen? And if it does, do you think there are benefits that are going to come from that across Cascadia?
I'm a skeptic on that. I'm in favor of medium speed rail. You know, if we can get rail up to what it used to be in the 1920s, we'd be doing great. We used to have 120 mile per hour passenger rail in the 1920s. We don't have that anymore. I'm a skeptic because of many reasons. It comes back to the point of my enthusiasm for this idea of greener, cheaper, smarter infrastructure. If we calibrate, you know, the kind of infrastructure support for the world that I'm imagining coming in the future, our overall objective should be to support the most people for the least amount of money in various ways, and particularly when we think about infrastructure. And for me, my debates in this city have been against a massively expensive subway proposal and in favor of universal application of greenhouse gas zero surface, rail, and bus transportation so that everybody would be served, not just one corridor. I have a phrase that I use for the thinking that tends to drive things like the Cascadia proposal to link Portland to Vancouver via high-speed rail, which would certainly be a $20 billion plus and enterprise, maybe $40 or $50 billion for all I know, given the topographic constraints between the three cities. I call that the ravings of the booster class. You know, it's kind of the same, and it comes from the same enthusiasm about economic development, which in our city of Vancouver is really pouring gasoline on the dumpster fire of housing affordability. So expenditures on infrastructure can either support social equity or they can operate against it. And very expensive taxpayer-funded projects that advance the agenda of the 1% or the booster class, I think need to be assessed against their negative consequences to the 99% who just really need an affordable place to live and an affordable way to get around. So this is this is fairly complicated. It has taken me a long time in my own thinking to connect infrastructure expenditures to social inequity, but that's where I am now. So I kind of automatically am very allergic to these very expensive high-tech George Jetson kind of strategies, even those that are sort of wrapped with the green glow of greenhouse gas and sustainability, which I find particularly obnoxious. In the case of the overpriced subway project for the city of Vancouver, and also I would apply that same pejorative to the Cascadia high-speed rail project.
Okay, good. There's actually a couple questions about pushing back against single occupancy vehicles. Bill Leidy and Jan Spencer, I'm going to combine their questions. And could you address the issue of pushing back on cars, especially if we're looking at Barcelona's super blocks? There's a lot of towns now restricting the use of cars, such as Utrecht and Groningen in Holland, Ghent, Freiburg, even cities in the U.S. like New York with 14th Street, Portland, Oregon, and now San Francisco's a Market Street, which is a car-free zone. So what are your thoughts about car-free zones or car-free cities? Are we ever going to get there? How do we get people around affordably? You mentioned bus and light rail and surface streets. And do you have thoughts also about micro-mobility as an answer to this?
Yeah, I'm a very strong. If you take all the 5 rules together, and if you appreciate the kinds of environments that South American favelas present in terms of their street vitality, the combination of living, working, and commerce in one location, how they evolve over time to be as beautiful as Greek island villages. If you take that kind of avenue forward and apply it to this question of transportation, where it gets me is to be able to imagine a very efficient landscape, an affordable landscape, where we're not exhausting ourselves by putting too much money into transportation and creating barriers to basically walking and biking. So these very efficient, very sustainable neighborhoods that I've become so enthusiastic about, that are, termed by many people as slums, but as they mature, they become very wonderful places, have this characteristic where they don't really need anything but buses and at best it's a light rail system, and otherwise 80% of what happens is biking and walking. The best of European cities, for example, Amsterdam, transit is only 15 to 20%. I might have the statistics kind of wrong. Biking and walking are the predominant mode of getting around the city, and that's a question of the degree of interconnection of urban uses, a medium density over a large area. It's basically an urban design structural solution. So it doesn't require kind of policy impediments or tax credits to buy a Tesla or whatever else it is that we're doing in the United States to kind of solve the climate crisis. It's just a matter of form. And my enthusiasm, my push for this book and these 5 rules, which are moving in an opposite direction from most of my peers in the sustainable cities world, is from a recognition of 2 things. For every dollar spent on stuff, there's a dollar's worth of global damage done, and that applies for every trillion. So if you look at your urban systems and you try to reduce the costs down to a fraction of what they are now, and you look around the world for how might that look, you end up understanding that the degree of entrepreneurial possibilities, low cost infrastructure, low cost buildings, adaptable buildings, is not something you find in, as I mentioned in the talk, eco-cities in China, which are unaffordable, absolutely, and don't actually perform that well on the sustainability indicators. You find that the precedents are, well, in U.S. terms, what people are doing in former suburban areas of Los Angeles, but in global terms, what's happening in Curitiba and in Medellin, Colombia, and in Dharavi district in Mumbai. If we look out 50 years against the context of this global migration, the mixing of cultures, the radical emergence of the service, of a service-dominated global economy, including the gig economy, then that leads me to a different image of a city that doesn't require the kind of transportation infrastructure that we're doing now. Imagining the reconstruction of the American urban landscape is a very difficult challenge, however, because we've overinvested in freeway infrastructure and parking lots and strip commercial. So it's going to be quite challenging, but I really think it's worth thinking about at this stage of the game so that we don't continue to pile mistake onto mistake. And I think things like high-speed rail and, Uber and electrifying everybody driving a Tesla is maybe nice, but in the end, it's unaffordable and unsustainable financially, and in terms of the global resources necessary to keep such an infrastructure going. I see that as kind of a dead end.
Great. Last question from Thomas McKay, who says, coming from South America, I know how hard it is to live in the favelas or informal cities. There's a lot of violence and drugs. Of course, poverty is always more sustainable, but there is a profound lack of basic services. This is why everybody wants to live in a more unsustainable city or gated community. So what, Patrick, do you think we could do to find a balance between those two dichotomies?
Yeah, I mean, I get this question all the time, and it's a good thing I have tenure because I can say outrageous things, and one of them is to celebrate so-called slums. So in the book, I go in and I try to acknowledge deeply that these places emerge out of lack of choice and lack of financial opportunity. And of course, people would have preferred probably to live in a high-rise with a pool, on the roof. Who wouldn't? So I acknowledge that in the book, and I also acknowledge that because of the informality of these areas, both culturally and the poverty of the inhabitants, they tended to be fertile grounds for drug cartels and so forth to take control of those neighborhoods. So I acknowledge that. Having said that, Medellin, Colombia is a very interesting example where the mayor there a decade or more ago, confronted with this problem, was able to recognize through a strategy which in urban design terms is called urban acupuncture, which is something I quite celebrate, which is taking a careful incision into an existing informal neighborhood, such as the aerial trams or the exterior escalators to get you up into the hill, and do that in concert with satellite police stations and satellite community centers and satellite libraries and schools and so forth to extend the cultural infrastructure into those neighborhoods, was remarkably successful. And the second thing I will say is that in places like Sao Paulo, for example, neighborhoods that started off as informal and also occupied by the poor and the social difficulties that the poor always experience, have gradually, since many of them are mature, have gradually over 50 years become desirable areas. And as they become more desirable, they look less and less like a slum and more like a nice neighborhood. The roads get paved, trees get planted, the buildings get painted, like the whitewash buildings of the Greek island villages. It's not well known that the image of the whitewash building with the blue roof church that we associate with Greek island villages is a 20th century phenomenon entirely, when these places started to attract tourism. Prior to that, they literally resembled many of South American favelas, and the experiments in some South American favelas where they've gone in, the community has gone in and sort of had, with the assistance of artists, paint beautiful, displays of wonderfully coordinated colors in a particular neighborhood, starts to suggest how incredibly favorable these places can be. They become more attractive than the unaffordable high rises that are nearby. So that's my only argument. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, Patrick. I was just observing our time. Yeah, thank you. Good. So I can see we're at the top of the hour, and a short survey is going to pop up for everybody when they close their browser. We really appreciate your feedback. We hope to see everybody at one of our upcoming events, which is all available at meetingoftheminds.org. And a huge thanks to Patrick today for the time you've put into this and sharing your work with us. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, everybody. That concludes our session today. Have a great day, and thanks again for attending. See you all soon.